All right, thank you for coming, and sorry for the slow start, but we got there eventually. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Lenore Thompson. She's an archaeological researcher and impact officer at the University of Derby. Lenore received her BA at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and completed her MA and PhD at the University of Sheffield. She's been a professional archaeologist for over 20 years, beginning her work with Indigenous communities in Canada and subsequently taking part in projects worldwide. Her research focuses on culture contact, colonialism, and their societal impacts. Her research focuses on material culture, investigating how people make things, and I should know this way better. Investigating how people make things and things make people. Lenore sits on the Council for the Society of Post-Medieval Archaeology and is a member of the Register of Professional Archaeologists. It's an impact officer who supports researchers as they design their work and consider its impact to publics beyond academia. And today she's going to talk about some Northwest American archaeology.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm going to talk to you guys about some stuff that I did for my PhD. So it's a wide-ranging topic. So we're going to go on a bit of a journey through time on the Northwest coast together. So we're rethinking Indigenous copper use in the Pacific Northwest during the fur trade and colonial periods. And if you guys have any questions, I mean, I'm open to chatting about pretty much anything after. So we're gonna go through time and we're gonna look at what Indigenous people were doing with copper and what happened during the fur trade and colonial period. So and why that matters today. So in this presentation, we've got the Northwest Coast and what that means. I don't know how many of you are super familiar with the Northwest Coast of Canada. The Indigenous communities and their relationships with copper there, copper use through the cultural contact, fur trade, and colonial periods. So they're a bit different for various reasons that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about copper objects and material analysis and how they tell maybe a different story than what we're used to hearing about Indigenous people in North America. I'm going to largely point at, over and over again through this talk, that manufactured copper, not the native metal that naturally occurs in the area, was there way earlier than anyone has really agreed it was, and that Indigenous and engaging with it in their own way, and that we should really sort of respect that and the sort of very flexible, very strong culture that was on the Northwest Coast. So we often get told the story about how Europeans showed up and wow, they have all this amazing material and it sort of like rocked the Indigenous people's world, and that isn't true at all. And my research, my PhD really underscored that. So I'm gonna bring us back to that sort of topic over and over again through different talking points through this talk. So first, a little bit of a rough timeline because it gets a bit confusing. There's some hopping around. So we're going to talk about sort of pre-colonial contact. The first contact on the Northwest Coast that we know of is, or that's recorded, is 1774 with the Spanish frigate Santiago. Then we're going to talk a bit about the Nootka crisis that happens in 1790. We're going to talk about what the Russians and the Tlingit were doing in the north. This will all become clear. We're going to talk through some stories about contact with people and how they sort of came head to head with Indigenous people, Europeans, Indigenous people, and what that meant. We'll bring it back to copper. And then we'll talk about the end of the fur trade and the beginning of the colonial period. And this is important because during the fur trade, before there was colonial outposts, the power that Indigenous people had in the whole situation was much more level. The Northwest Coast is really difficult to get around on if you're not super familiar with it. So the power that Indigenous people had over the situation and the trade and what was going on with their interactions was much more of a level playing field than it was after outposts. Europeans started forming outposts and sort of taking over the land. And then and we'll talk about the Hudson's Bay Company and its acts in that. And then in 1971, British Columbia, as it joins the rest of Canada. There's an Indian Act in 1876, which tries to formalize the power of Canada over Indigenous people, and the potlatch ban, which we'll talk about, and then we'll get to why this is sort of important to us today. So the Northwest Coast, this is the Northwest Coast. It's a huge area. So it's a couple thousand miles from south to north. There's a lot of different groups. They're ethno-linguistic groups. So they are different in some ways, but the reason that the Northwest Coast as a culture area exists is because they share lots of overlaps in the way that they create art, in the way that they think about the world around them, and the way that they value certain things. And copper is one of those things. So copper, to the people on the Northwest Coast, is this animistic. So in their animistic worldview, it's this alive material. It does stuff. It has power, and it's really important and powerful itself. So if you find a piece of copper, it's allowed you to find it, and it's allowed you to engage with it and use it. And so you, by association, gain some power and prestige by having that relationship with this material. And so the way that people thought about copper in this area is like that. So when it's involved, when they use it to embellish their other artifacts, other objects around them, when they use it, it's something that shows how powerful they are. And within this area, so these ethno-linguistic groups, they have chiefs, but they're not chiefs as you would think of them as like kings. They have to earn their position. So having things like copper back up their right to be in power is sort of important, right? So so along here you get these people having a good old time. And the way that people live outside of this area down here, they use copper, but they don't think of it as the same sort of powerful being. And then up in the Arctic, you get the different culture groups, the Aleut. For example, they use copper. They make really, really great blades with it. But again, they don't think about it the same way in terms of its value and power. So, and then just to give you an idea of how actually intricate this area is. This is, if you go to nativeland.ca, you can look at the different actual asserted territories of Indigenous people across Canada, and this is what it actually looks like. So it's a busy place. There were lots of people. There was way more people than we traditionally get taught living in Canada before contact, and smallpox has a lot to do with that. And also, it's easier to tell a colonial story of taking over land if there was no one there, terra nullius. But in fact, there was a ton of people. And so copper, native copper occurs naturally in different areas in Canada, around the Great Lakes, up in the Arctic, in the east, and then along the Northwest Coast. It occurs naturally in the north and the south, but the largest deposits are in the north, up in the Wrangell St. Elias mountain range, and loads of the Indigenous names for the area have to do with copper. So all of these rivers, and you've got the Copper River, and there's loads of different areas around there that are all named after copper. And so copper occurs, it occurs as the rock is forming. It forms naturally. When the mountain range was forming, and then it erodes out as nuggets and as seams. So this is actually a piece of a copper seam that's eroded out of the mountain, sort of found its way down the river drainage that I'm stood by, and at McBride Museum in Whitehorse, Yukon, and it's huge. So it's quite thick, and it's like you kind of find it sort of everywhere if you know where to look. And Indigenous people. So this is Copper River, went down there. It's absolutely amazing. And how the Indigenous people used to find the copper, and the area was controlled. You had to be allowed to go there. So when people went to collect copper, they were people that had the right to go to that area, and they were accepted as someone who was powerful enough to be able to find it and collect it. And what they would do, is quite clever, is wait till it snows and then go look for the green stains in the snow, put down a marker, and then come back when it's all melted and get the copper, which is way easier than finding rusty copper in that. So, and so it's all coming down from the mountains as it erodes, and there's quite a lot of it there. So people worked the copper. They didn't ever smelt or melt on the Northwest Coast, and they knew how to. By the time the Europeans show up and are showing them their smelting and melting techniques, they were seemingly pretty comfortable with the whole situation. They just didn't want to have anything to do with it themselves. They hammered and annealed stuff. So with the native copper, they found it, and then they, I don't know how many of you are familiar with metalworking, but in a really, really rough sort of outline of what it is, you take your nugget of metal, your nugget of copper, and it's actually made of crystals, and you can bash the heck out of it until it's a shape that you like, and at some point it'll start to get really hard. And if you put it in a fire, what's happened is you've smashed all those crystals up, and they're kind of all like jammed up together and can't move very easily. And when you put it in a fire, it helps those crystals relax back out. But then you get, if you look at it under a microscope, under here you can see these like straight lined, these two straight lines together. They're called annealing twins. So it's easy to look at a piece of metal, of copper specifically, under the microscope and see these annealing twins and know that they were hammering and annealing it. And you get these very sort of telltale marks. So that's something that they did, and they would make things like, so here's a bracelet that's just been sort of bashed together. But one of the things they did was they made things into sheets and then rolled it. So it would look like quite a substantial bar, but actually it's quite light. Good for a bracelet. And they did that again. These is actually a whole bunch of tubes. You can see the seam, a whole bunch of tubes, and then they've been twisted together. It looks really amazing and intricate from a distance. And then when you look at it up close, this is what you get. So lots of experiments hammering copper during my PhD. So good reason to go outside. So you get these sort of different ways of working things, lots of sort of stretching the copper out to what you need it to be and making it into a form. But let me tell you, you get something that's even that thick, and making that a thin piece of sheet metal takes, on my untrained self, thousands of hours. So there's that. And so early copper artifacts are largely found in the south. So even though most of the copper naturally occurring in the north, there is native copper in the south. But the reason we probably find this stuff in the south earliest is because it was in cyst burials, so it was protected from the acidic soils of the region. And you get these like pendants and stuff. And this is thought to be, again, some tubes made. And this is a fabric is actually wood bark. So wood bark and leather. And then you've got this like these copper shields. The earliest known artifact dated in the south was dated to 550 AD. So that's really early for what people think. But that date, there are some questions about that date because it didn't take into account the marine effect. So there's some questions about that date, but there is definitely native copper objects found on the northwest coast in the south from about 1000 AD. And then, so these, when I had an XRF and I ran all over the place. So and got to go to loads of museums all over the world. Colonialism really spread everything out. So good for travel, less good for repatriation for Indigenous people. But that is a really early object, and is consistent with native copper, which is quite exciting. And then to give you an idea of what copper was used for, it was used sort of to embellish lots of really amazing things. So that libret up there, that's native copper. It's a wooden libret with native copper in it. And that's native copper there in this feasting spoons. They made these great spoons out of like mountain goat horn and mountain sheep horn. And they would use it to serve like oolakan fish oil at feasts and things. And they're absolutely marvelous to look at. But so there's you can see native copper inlaid into it. It's a fish, a skate. This is a Tlingit dagger. They live in the north. Tlingit live sort of they edge into Alaska a little bit. They're the most northerly of the northwest coast communities. Coast Salish in the south with some arrows. The arrows are interesting. Oral tradition says they were only really used to hunt copper arrows to hunt very specific things, including bears and people. So don't know what was going on there. And this is one of the masks used in like a potlatch regalia ceremony. And this guy's great. His eyes actually flip around, and he's got eyeballs. He had like almost 50 pieces of copper sort of all over him. So it's pretty great, and XRF'd everything. And then the most sort of well-known object that you find on the Northwest Coast are these things that we call coppers. So to the indigenous people, they weren't called coppers. They actually had names and histories, and they went through, as they were used in different ceremonies, they would sort of gain this like weight of heritage that made them more valuable and more meaningful. And so all of these guys, they're ones that are, quite a lot of them are like a meter tall or more. And so if we go back to how difficult it is to work a thick piece of metal that is a big solid piece of metal like that one, it's pretty much impossible. And when I XRF'd all of these, none of them are consistent with native metal. So that's sort of the beginning of my argument about how trade metals were on the coast from earlier than we expected, because these pop up from almost the moment that Europeans start arriving on the Northwest Coast. They start noticing these and big coppers, not just little ones. You get little ones, you get some very cute little ones, and ones that are made into strings of necklaces and things like that. They're absolutely fantastic. But they start noticing these massive pieces of metal. So the only way that you could get, and they're very uniform in thickness, they're not consistent with a native copper. Native copper is in this region is about 99% copper with a little bit of iron and a little bit of silver, which are other metals that are very basically ubiquitous in the soil up there. Iron for sure, and there's lots of silver. And then so these guys all have zinc, they have tin, they have lead, and they're sort of consistent with maritime metals that we'll come on to here. But so these coppers, they, as you use them, they gather heritage and history to them. So here you can see this one's made out of multiple pieces of metal that have all been riveted together. And so that's something that has been built potentially over time. It's potentially gone through acts of breaking and making. And so what happens with these guys is there's the potlatch. And so this is a festival that is like a reciprocal gift-giving festival where it was a way to celebrate name days and different sort of events that were happening. But it was also a way to battle without battling. So you could invite your neighbors over, and a way to distribute wealth so that everybody had enough. So you would invite your neighbors over, and you'd have a potlatch, and at a potlatch you would give gifts to everyone. And subsequently, if they couldn't have a potlatch where they invited you and gave you even more stuff, then you kind of won, right? And there was gifts of canoes, there's gifts of food, gifts of like fabrics, and things like that. There would be dances, things would be celebrated, people would gain prestige. And one of the things that you would do with a copper is you could either give it away to someone, and then they would have to be able to give you back that amount of copper, which is kind of a big deal. Or you could do a thing where you broke a bit off and discarded that broken piece of copper, and then they would have to be able to do the same. And so it was a way to have a battle without actually having a big fight. So, and it was a way to make sure, especially in times and years where it was lean, that food was distributed in a way where everyone was okay. Because you also like wanted to trade with your neighbors, and you also wanted to like, generally get along with them. Sometimes not so much, but generally. So that was like sort of what was going on with these potlatches. They're absolutely fantastic. I've been to one, and they're very, very cool events. And so, and here's an example of coppers through time. So we've got this guy in 1894, and he's celebrating his son's name day. He's broken a piece off for it, but you can see that copper's already been broken a couple times. And this guy here, so Edward Curtis traveled up and down the Northwest coast taking photos of everybody. He traveled all over North America, to be honest, taking photos of everybody. And so he's got this great picture of this guy. And he's got a copper nose ring as well. And then we've got Willie Seaweed, and he's got 2 coppers. This copper pops up everywhere. It's called long top, and it gets like showed. It's in lots of textbooks. It gets talked about a lot. And there was even a copper that was Mungo Martin presented to the Queen in 1958. So like they've been used through time. They're really quite prestigious objects. And so the weight of that history, and you've got them, being used from like the late 1700s onwards. And if we think about what I mentioned as the Europeans showing up for, as we know, the first time, as we think of the first time is 1774, and you've got this tradition of coppers being used on the Northwest coast in this huge area from then. It's hard to imagine that tradition just popped up straight away and everyone's doing the same thing and they're able to communicate this. So, right, so we go back through time, we'll go to the fur trade. So the fur trade is an interesting time. The Europeans start showing up, and what they want is they want sea otter pelts. Sea otters are actually really hard to catch. So instead of trying to catch them themselves, they traded with the indigenous people, and they would come from Europe, get to the Northwest coast, fill their boats up with sea otter pelts, sail over to China, make a boatload of money, literally, and then come back and do rounds. And they would spend years away from home doing these sort of rounds of like hunting, which is why they almost went extinct. Poor sea otters. But when they showed up on the Northwest coast, they showed up ready to trade with all the things that they thought indigenous people would like that had worked before. So they had glass beads and they had snuff boxes and stuff like that, and little mirrors. The people on the Northwest coast, seasoned traders at this point, and they'd seen people coming from inland, and they'd probably seen people sailing up to the coast before what we know of. We're like, we don't want any of that, but we will have that copper you've got there. And so the Europeans, they coppered the bottoms of their ships. So for various reasons, one, to prevent ship fouling from shipworm. It also helped you go faster through the water. It helped when the British were fighting the Spanish at sea. Having the bottom of your ship coppered meant you could spin around faster to shoot at them with your cannons. So there's lots of benefits to this. Also, it doesn't corrode like iron does. And it has, like natural repelling effects for things like shipworm. And so protects the bottoms of your boats. And it's these big sheets of copper. So anybody thinking coppers right now? So there are stories when Europeans first pulled up to the Northwest coast of indigenous people getting in their boats in the nighttime, sailing up to their ships and peeling some of this off, taking it home with them. And then there's great ship's logs writing home and saying, when you come next, don't bother with all these glass beads, but bring extra copper. And so they did. And so I went and scanned a whole ton of copper. I actually went to the HMS Victory and I got to scan its keel, which is cool, and its rudder. So that was a good day out. But and I was hoping, because you find these things, you find the maker's marks on them. So I was hoping I might be able to find some of that on some of the indigenous objects, but the indigenous people knew what they were doing and they processed their metal to make it exactly what they wanted it. So it's kind of unlikely that you would find it. But these objects are, if you aren't familiar with maritime copper, copper is expensive, but if you add a lot of zinc and make some brass, or you add a lot of tin, make some bronze, you have a cheaper metal. So these objects are all quite quite high zinc, usually a fair bit of tin, although bronze is harder to work with, lots of lead. So all of a sudden, you've got a cheaper metal that you can cover the bottoms of a whole bunch of ships with. You've got massive sheets of copper that you can trade with indigenous people, and it's much more affordable. And this stuff is, when I scanned those coppers and lots of the pieces of copper that were used to embellish objects and create beads and things on the Northwest Coast, they were consistent with this manufactured metal. So we can have a huge conversation about maritime metal patents later if you like. So talking about complicated relationships on the Northwest Coast, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, sort of bring it back to copper use. So the Nootka crisis. So we've got this chief McKenna. He's a Nuu-Chah-Nulth chief, and he lives in Nootka Sound, which translate to copper sound. So there's quite a lot of metal there for trade. Also, lots and lots of sea otter pelts, and the Sound was this really quite big area that you could pull a tall ship into and have a safe place to park up, which is difficult to find on the Northwest Coast. So it was a popular place to go and trade. So of course, the Spanish and the English had a massive fight over who owned this land, and it almost sparked an international crisis. So it was called the Nootka crisis, and there's a whole treaty and everything. So Nuu-Chah-Nulth chief McKenna here was like, it's very unlikely that you'll ever actually take over this land because you all don't know what you're doing anyway. So instead of being super worried about that, he was like, I will facilitate your talks and then I'll trade with both of you. So he did a he did a deal with both of them. He helped them work out their problems, and then he was able to trade with both of them and make the most out of it all. So, quite savvy traders. But then things got a bit tough. And so by the time you get to 1803, so the Nootka crisis was 1790 to 1795. But after that, fewer and fewer people were coming to the Sound, largely because the sea otter was dying out. So there was less reason to go there. And so fewer people were coming to Nootka Sound, and then they were a bit rude. So Chief McKenna was, this ship called the Boston showed up, and the McKenna and his band greeted them and went onto the ship and thought they were just a bit too rude. So they were like, you know what? We're not going to get much out of you anyway. So why don't we just burn your ship down, kill you all, and take your stuff? But they'd noticed that this guy, John R. Jewett, was the metallurgist on the boat. Every boat had a metallurgist to fix stuff and to re-copper the bottoms and to do stuff like that. So they raided the boat at night and went and basically killed everybody and burned the ship down and took what they wanted from it. But they didn't kill John, and they didn't kill this guy that John claimed was his father. He wasn't his father, but he managed to save this one guy. Oh, that's my dad, don't kill him. So they were both taken as slaves for 3 years. They lived with the Nuu-Chah-Nulth from 1803 to 1805. And during that time, he ended up with a wife. Being a slave was a little bit different among the Nuu-Chah-Nulth. So instead of total indentured servitude, when he was outside of working hours, he could actually work for himself and make money, from making metal things for other people. But one of the things they did, and it really sort of gives us some insight into the indigenous view about metal and how you should work it and the proper ways to engage with it. When they went to go and strip everything from the ship, he asked for his tools, and he asked for his bellows, and he asked for his anvil, and they said no. So he had some of his tools were collected for him. Some of them they refused to let him have because that wasn't the way that you should interact with metal. And so even though he was a specialist in metal and they recognized that, and they knew about smelting and melting, they had a very specific view about how you interact with metal. So he has written a book about it. And then when he ended up back in England, after all of this went down. He tried to sell it and make some money off of it. And it gives you a sort of really interesting look into like the world living amongst the Nuu-chah-nulth and what happened to him. And how he escaped really is another boat pulled up. He'd kind of become the keenest friend in those 3 years. Another boat pulled up in 1805, and he was used as a translator. And instead of translating for the band, he wrote, "Please help me, I've been taken captive." And so they took him and his quote unquote father home. But he had to sail with them for like another year and a half before he could get home. So, but it really gives us this like sort of look into what Indigenous people were thinking about the metal and how they were, you know, they were aware of the changes in culture. They were aware of all these things, but they were fairly strong in their opinions about what should be. And then we get to the Russians, and the Russians are a whole different world. They came across the Bering Strait and into through the Aleutian Islands, and in doing so, it's actually really hard work. You have to get across Siberia, and then you have to build a boat, and then you have to sail across the Bering Strait. So the majority of the boats they built sunk. So it was really hard to convince Russian people to go to the Northwest Coast. And one of the ways that they went about engaging with Indigenous people wasn't to trade as such. Instead, they abducted people and threatened their families to work for them, or they wouldn't give their families back. So they had a way of getting Indigenous people involved. And so which led to things like in the Aleutian Islands, the Aleut, some of the people that they took with them to work for them ended up in like Russian colonies in Northern California and in Hawaii, which must have been wild. But then they got down to the Northwest Coast and the Tlingit in the north, and the Tlingit communities were more cohesive than the more northern communities, and were a bit more willing to fight to the death over their land. So things got a bit contentious, and you get to Sitka. So this island here, they is in the north, and so Juneau there. If you think about Sitka Island, is just south of Alaska, and it's the most northerly. They're the most northerly communities in the Northwest Coast. So when the Russians pulled up to Sitka, there's this place called Castle Hill, which was this. So this is a drawing of it when it was a Russian fort. Before that, it was an Indigenous outpost. It was their fort, it was Tlingit Fort. And Baranov, the Russian captain, guy in control, he wanted to set up a fort there, and he really wanted to move the Indigenous people out, but couldn't. And then in 1802, the Tlingit were forever raiding the Russian camps. And so there was a big, devastating raid in 1802. Lots of Russian people died. So there was a bit of a regroup, and they brought some ships over. And then in 1804, they carried out a bit of, I guess, what's colloquially known as gunboat diplomacy, where they parked a boat just off the shore and fired cannons at them till everyone left, and took over Castle Hill. And so when they did that, they picked through the rubble afterwards. And this guy, Yuri Lysiansky, he wrote a book. So he wrote in 1804, but this is from 1804 when they picked through the rubble. And they found this in one of the huts. So in 1804, they found this guy, and he drew a picture of it, and he wrote, "A thin plate made of virgin copper found on the Copper River in the north of Sitka." So you can see where we get the idea it's made from native metal, but it was, he says, really, really big. So the value of the plate depends, it seems, on its being made of virgin copper. From the common copper ones don't bear the higher price than a single skin. And so, yeah, they get this idea, but it was likely that it was worth so much more because it had been involved in like cultural activities and things. And then to give you an idea of, in 1787, this guy named James Colnett, he sort of sailed up to Haida Gwaii. Colonial name is Queen Charlotte Islands, but they've changed it back to Haida Gwaii. So this copper he saw in the back, it was just in the background as he was trying to do some trading. So he never really got to like engage with it very much. But he drew this picture of it and he had no idea what it was. He thought it was armor because he was like, I don't know what you would do with that. That's weird. But it was over 1 meter in height and had these designs on it and is very clearly a copper. So again, he's seeing that in 1787, and it seems kind of incredulous to believe that you've got this cohesive culture of people engaging with these giant copper things right after Europeans arrive and trade metals available. So it's very likely that that trade metal was there much earlier. And then if you're thinking, well, what about antecedents? Did they make something that looked like coppers before out of wood or bone, and then they just started using metal, big sheets of metal when it became available? And there's no known examples of antecedents of coppers. So of things that look like coppers but aren't made from copper, this guy was found in, but it dates to 1888, and that's whalebone. And this is what, shale? And 1886. So there's no known antecedents that were made from something more readily available than the metal. So and then going back to the colonial period, we've got the first Canadian or the first Hudson's Bay Company. There we go. Kind of like the East Indian Company, but Canadian. Actually, they were part of the East Indian Company, so kind of exactly like that. But their first fort was in Fort Vancouver, and that was 1821, and that's really the beginning of the colonial period. So that's when the sort of power imbalance really starts to take shape. Europeans start to really take hold of the land and start developing things like the reservation system, which has resulted in Indigenous people living on about 1 to 2% of the land that they had. It's been pretty devastating over the years, and so they use these steamships to travel up and down the coast because it's kind of rugged going across this territory, and they would set up forts near where the Indigenous people lived this semi-nomadic lifestyle where they would travel around, and at certain points of the year they would go when the berries were ready, or when the elk were good for hunting, or when the like wild potatoes were ready to pick and things like that. And then there was times of year when they would all get together, like when the salmon were running, to trade. So they would all meet in a place at a time of year, and so those trading places were places that the Hudson's Bay Company set up forts to try and like get involved with Indigenous trade. And they also used credit to try and tie the Indigenous people to the forts. So we've given you stuff, now you give us stuff. And now you owe us for the credit we've given you, so you can't stop giving us stuff. So they did that, kind of incipient. And they also engaged a bit in the smallpox blankets trade. So as well, so there's stories of when smallpox broke out up and down the coast, having boats sail up there with some goods to try and kind of get rid of the Indigenous problem. So so lots of shady things that the Hudson's Bay Company were up to at the time. The Indigenous people, again, no slouches, we're very much into being like, we'll pay you back, definitely. Just find us. So they did take advantage of the situation as well. So they're not just pushovers. That should not be the impression anyone gets from the interactions they had. And they what else did I want to say? I think it's gone now. I can't remember anything else. This guy, Sir James Douglas, some people have a more kind read of him than I do, but he was the one who started setting up reservations and getting First Nations people to sign away their land. So the kinder read is that because they have signed treaties, they still have rights to their land, which not all the Indigenous people across Canada can say. The less kind read is that he came up with a clever way to get people to sign their land away. So there's that. But then at the same time, the Hudson's Bay Company also started making coppers of their own to trade, to try and sort of get involved with what the indigenous people were doing. So they were actually known as smooth-faced coppers, and the indigenous people took them and then used them as like a lower form of currency instead of being involved in the like the traditions, the potlatches, the building of a heritage and history. They were used. So in a potlatch, when you were giving people like 1,000 blankets, and you'd have like your coppers that you did all these like amazing things with and broke them and celebrated stuff. And then these would be some sort of lower form of currency, like, oh, and here's some coppers, some of those like white man's coppers. So there was a sort of a tension going on with the indigenous people and the colonists. And we get to the potlatch ban. So the potlatch ban came into effect in 1884, but it went underground. So indigenous people, as a testament to their flexibility, they would use things like Christmas, the time of giving, to have a potlatch and things like that. And they would often make off with credited Hudson's Bay blankets. They became pretty popular in the potlatch, and they'd get loads of Hudson's Bay blankets and then just sort of make off with them and never pay anybody back. So the potlatch ban came in 1884, and the potlatches carried on sort of in secret. And so this is from 1922, and it's Dan Cranmer's potlatch, and in it the police raided it, and they collected 45 people were apprehended, 22 were actually jailed, and over 450 objects were seized. And then they were put on display in the community, but people had to pay to see them. And then they were sold off to, so if you want to feel some affront here, and then they were sold off to museums all over the world. So now, where this happened, the community where this happened, they've built the Umista Cultural Center, which you can go visit, and they've been working to repatriate these objects. They haven't got them all back, but they've got a good lot of them back. And so these sort of pictures help them both find things nowadays, but are like at the time just a little bit of an affront. So to give you an idea of sort of the tension that was going on, and again, this is what we're finding here. So of the coppers they took from this potlatch, you see all these objects that have clearly been involved in lots and lots of activity culturally. And then this is from 1927, and this is it's in the Kwakwaka'wakw region as well, and up at Petley Point. It's down a river, and it's quite big actually. This guy is like probably about that big in real life. They're like paintings on the rock, and this is like a really interesting sort of insight into sort of the way that the indigenous culture could sort of deal with change and sort of keep themselves, right? So we've got coppers, we've got a broken copper, we've got some cows, we've got a steamboat. So there's like a way for them to be a flexible people doing all kinds of things, but retaining their culture. And so it's like again, when we're thinking about how indigenous people might have been like, oh, totally surprised by Europeans showing up and then trading this amazing copper with them. I don't think they were at all. And I think they were actually quite astute at trading at the time, and pretty ready for it. So I took an XRF and ran all over the world with it, had a great time. And scanned all of these objects. And honestly, the museums everywhere I went couldn't have been more helpful. But then I looked at, coppers. I looked at 65 coppers. Yeah, 65 coppers in total. I managed to get my hands on and scan. And they were all consistent with manufactured metal. So of the ones that were provenanced, that was also a tricky thing. I looked, so we've got what, 7 Haida versus 9 Kwakwaka'wakw coppers. And there was some oral traditions that talked about the different proportions of a northern versus southern copper and how you could recognize them by the northern ones being bigger and more flared, and the southern ones being more narrow. And so I tested it, and it's true. So turns out they really are easy to like identify visually, and there's a whole tradition about it, and you can find it in oral histories of the stories of their use. So to give you an idea, you wanted to guess which one was from the north and which one was from the south. These are 2 unprovenance coppers. But if I was going to have a guess, I'd guess north and south. So so it's an interesting bit of I don't know, really hardcore example of how entrenched these objects were. And these are not little objects. So if we're thinking about copper getting to the Northwest Coast before, um, before Europeans showed up, there is the possibility of drift copper. So drift copper is when you've got a shipwreck and then stuff washes up on the coast. And there is actually loads of oral histories about that happening. And then you've got quite interestingly. So you've got the stuff from Russia, and there are many sunken ships. But then there's also Japan. So in the Jomon period, they were smelting copper, right? So that's like I had to write this down because I always forget. 500 BC, right? So they've got smelted copper forever. And then the Edict period. It's a really interesting study this guy did. So the Edict period was from 1636 to 1867. Japan shut its doors completely. And part of the laws about no one coming into Japan and no one leaving Japan were that all of the fishing vessels had to be crippled, essentially. They weren't able to sail the high seas. So any ship that got caught in any kind of current and swept to sea ended up not being able to get back. So there was a study, and it's like over 1,800 ships were wrecked on the Northwest Coast from Japan. So you've got lots and lots of opportunity for drift copper and manufactured metal. And then if you look at the overland possibilities, so you've got native copper coming from the Great Lakes region. You've got native copper from northern and southern Northwest Coast, and then you've got native copper way up north. So here, there was a guy named Francisco de Elza, and he came up to the Fraser River. The Fraser River's about right there. In 1792, and talked to some indigenous people who were like, "Oh, we've been getting trade from over the mountains and over the plains for ages. Like we've already seen all this stuff that you're trying to bring to us. So you've got evidence of trade coming across the Northwest Coast." And sorry, across the Great Plains, across Canada, essentially. And if you think about like from the year 0 to 400 AD, there's evidence of copper use in the Great Lakes region. So I personally think that there was quite a lot of stuff coming from people, Europeans already coming to the East Coast quite a bit earlier than the West Coast. And then copper being used here. And then, of course, these trade routes. And I think that we've done quite a lot to undermine Indigenous people's connectivity. And I think that that's something that was used as a way to reinforce colonialism and how we can take land. So when I think about copper and my research about copper, the really strong message is that there was connectivity and there was trade that we now don't know about, and it has helped sort of helped colonize Canada and help keep it that way. And so just to give you an idea, one last little story of the just even on the Northwest Coast trade. So there was a New Zealand patu that was traded to a member, or by a member of Captain Cook's crew, to the New Chalmette. that turned up 9 years later on Pitt Island, and that's 300 miles away. And that's not an easy coastline to get along. So, there was people moving everywhere. And when you take away that connectivity, it allows things like what we get nowadays, where even though Indigenous people have been pushed into really small areas of with reserves, and some people even without reserves, when someone wants to build something, say like a giant oil pipeline across their land, if you can disconnect them from their neighbors, it's easier to be able to do that. So I think that what my research shows us is that really there's a bigger story to be told about that connectivity, and that we have more to say about this. So, and like as an archaeologist, I actually worked on this reservoir with the Indigenous people, and saw like just how much damage there was from the dam that was built there, and it was a pretty crazy time. So I can talk to you way more about that later, but just a little bit of protest in the middle here. Right. So my concluding thoughts. So it's probable that significant amounts of manufactured copper and copper alloys were present and in use on the Northwest Coast prior to the initial arrival of European explorers and traders. There's a number of culturally significant copper artifacts made from manufactured metal. These artifacts are involved in established traditions and ceremonies spanning multiple ethno-linguistic cultural groups residing across the geographically large region. The ways in which these objects were formed and decorated appears standardized and recognizably specific between ethno-linguistic cultural groups in the region at the point of first known European contact. So, and how we interpret the past impacts what we do with our land and people in the present. So that is my slight tirade about copper on the Northwest Coast. And so I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank all of the First Nations that whose objects I've looked at and allowed me to look at their objects, and all of the museums that let me have access to their stuff, and the University of Sheffield for funding my magical mystery tour. So thank you. And
Thank you very much, Lenore, for your talk. Sorry about your lights. Got dark all of a sudden. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you. Because of our late start, I'm not sure how much time we have for questions. If anyone has a question in the room to start.
yeah.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. My question is about the kind of possibility of unpicking some of the individual histories of these coppers. It was quite interesting you were saying they were kind of riveted together and things like that. Is there any kind of work that could be done to kind of use like use-where analysis or other kinds of approaches to think about whether different coppers might have been riveted, unriveted, put back together over a period of time, and what that might tell us about how they're being thought about and understood, but also potentially about the complexity of unpicking the origins of any kind of copper source, because any particular object could potentially have copper from more than one origin point as part of it.
Okay, so yes, there was of the coppers. So of the coppers I looked at that were made of multiple pieces of metal, I analyzed all of the different pieces of metal, and often they were very different. They were from different batches of wherever they were made. So in terms of tool use, I did look at the different types of tools that were made to bring these bits of metal together. And there is the potential for looking specifically at those tools and creating a kind of catalog of different types of tools. The idea of finding, so no copper working areas have ever been found. So the oral traditions say that Indigenous manufacturing sites were outside of villages and kept separate and secret and safe, and that they did their work there, and then the metal objects would be brought into the community. So I have lots and lots of interest in trying to go and find those sites. But the only way that you could do that would be in collaboration with Indigenous people on the land. And so it would be a matter of working very closely with communities who wanted to find those sites and doing it that way. And then it's an interesting one. It's quite difficult to parse the tool use because there are only a certain amount of tools that were used. There was stone tools that were used like hammers, but then when iron tools were introduced, you see chisel marks, you see shears, and then sometimes they would get when ships would rock up, they would get the metallurgists on the ships to do some work for them as well. So there's some examples of copper bars that they wanted made into torques and bracelets that they just got the metallurgists on the ship to bend for them. So it's a real mix of like activity that I think would take a very specific approach, and it would have to be like, again, only done with Indigenous people.
Hi, and they love learning more about this topic. But are asking what were the motivations for the ban? Were there any form of resistance against the ban? Was anything else banned, like their language? They're thinking of Hawaii when Hawaii was colonized as an example of major aspects of Indigenous culture being banned.
So one of the main pieces of thinking around the potlatch ban was that when communities come together and celebrate together and have formalized celebrations, it really reinforces your culture. So they wanted to stop that. So when the potlatch ban was introduced, it was about civilizing the Indigenous people. And so the argument was that by allowing them to carry on with their cultural traditions, they were not civilizing. So there was active thought about that, and their language was also banned. And they were told if they wanted to do any kind of retaliation, it would have to be through court systems. And so the Indigenous people, as well as like going underground with the potlatch and in other ways fighting back, they also went through the court system. So they were as savvy as you could be, but the repression was quite bold. It was repealed in what 18 no, was it repealed 1950 something? So for quite a long time there was a active idea about what's the quote? It was like kill the Indian, save the man. So not awesome. So but yeah, it was like what happened in Hawaii where those things were actively repressed.